Thank you, Orla, and thank you to Joe for the invitation here today. It's a great honour for me always to speak about something as important as the Eighth Amendment, something which has done so much for our country. In assessing what the referendum result signifies, the first thing that ought to be explored is how... So in assessing what the referendum result signifies, the first thing that ought to be explored is how the result came about. At the time, the result was hailed as representing a seismic shift in public attitudes to abortion. The Taoiseach remarked that the result was the culmination of a quiet revolution that had been growing in momentum for some time. Newspaper headlines called the outcome a great day for democracy, an end to hypocrisy, a major step forward, and the dawn of a kinder, more compassionate Ireland. Most of the analysis and commentary surrounding the result that we have seen was premised on the idea that the referendum took place following a thorough and exhaustive debate where voters were given every reasonable opportunity to weigh the arguments from both sides before deciding which way to vote. Would that it were so. The truth, however, is very different. Because for years, the discussion on abortion in Ireland has taken place in a very one-sided fashion. We're told to trust women, but only some women. Trust doctors, but only some doctors. Trust headlines, but never ask what stories have been buried. And now that we're on the other side of the referendum, I would suggest it's time for us to step back as a country and have a more honest appraisal of how we address this issue. Regrettably, the case for repeal was amplified and aided at every turn by large sections of the mainstream media, while the arguments put forward by the pro-life side were constantly ridiculed, ignored, or treated with suspicion. And there's a lot of statistical evidence to back up this claim. For example, the 1 month period on RTE Radio 1, when 81 minutes were devoted to the pro-repeal side and just 4 minutes to the pro-life side. There are countless other examples. Over a single week on News Talk, there were 52 minutes given to the pro-repeal side and just 20 minutes for keeping the eighth. Or a random week in our national newspapers, where 18 pro-repeal opinion articles were published and not a single pro-life article. So it's not surprising that after so much undermining of the pro-life position, we would have a result that showed that that took its toll. The quiet revolution that the Taoiseach referred to was really a revolution that quietly shut out one side of the debate almost entirely. Now, statistics are one thing, but what's been most startling to me over the last few months has been the hypocrisy of a debate that congratulated itself as being inclusive, when in reality there was constant, determined exclusion of anyone whose experience didn't fit in with repeal. When Dr. Peter Boylan described the Eighth Amendment as a failed experiment and tried to depict it as something which had never done any good, a student that I know, Gavin Boyne, stepped up to say that his life was saved by the fact that the Eighth Amendment had kept abortion out of Ireland. His life, he said, is no failed experiment. And you know, it's quite something to see a young person come out of the fray of a referendum debate and say, I want to make my story heard, I want to make my voice heard. He deserved the chance to tell his story, but was completely ignored by the media. Just like all the parents who had similar stories to tell about how the time it took to make travel arrangements for an abortion was the time they needed to change their mind and decide to keep their child. Surely their testimonies were hugely relevant to the debate that we've just gone through, but they were excluded. How about when Dr. Fergal Malone, master of the Rotunda Hospital, described parents who received a positive test result indicating Down syndrome as the unfortunate few? People that I know like Monica Hadirian and Sinead McBreen and other parents who have children with Down syndrome were horrified. But there was little or no scrutiny or probing of Dr. Malone's comment. And we should be asking why not. Similarly, when the subject of adoption was brought up in the Oireachtas Committee, Deputy Kate O'Connell asked if we were going to have, and I quote, a Handmaid's Tale situation here, where women in crisis pregnancies will be detained, forced to become parents, and used as a source of supply of babies to childless people, unquote. Facetious and hurtful comments like these had no place in a sensitive debate about abortion, but more and more it felt like any abuse would be tolerated from pro-repeal advocates rather than challenge them and run the risk of weakening their case. What about the story of Miss C? Her high-profile case was referred to on a daily basis during the referendum campaign as an example of why we needed to vote for repeal. This was despite the fact that Miss C herself publicly pleaded with politicians and other abortion advocates to stop using her case to bring in abortion, as she deeply regretted her own abortion, which had a devastating effect on her life. Where was the media platform during the campaign for women like Miss C and countless other women who are living with the pain and heartbreak of abortion and wanted to tell their stories? Aside from a handful of low-profile interviews, their stories were airbrushed out of the debate, and there was little or no interest from politicians in listening to what they had to say. I would suggest that this attitude cannot continue, or we risk turning into a country where abortion becomes something that can't be questioned, and we abandon even the most basic respect that we should have for each other as human beings. No one can deny that the primary focus of the media coverage during the build-up to the referendum was on the so-called hard cases. And there's no question that this, in turn, helped create the false impression that the vote was about allowing abortion in these situations and little else, as opposed to the reality, which is that Ireland is set to have one of the most extreme abortion laws anywhere in the world, where all meaningful protections for unborn babies are obliterated. Voters were entitled to hear how our leading politicians feel about what repeal means, what is hidden behind the word choice. They had every right to hear the evidence of abortionist Dr. Peter Thompson, who presented to the Oireachtas Committee on Abortion. He describes in detail how in one of the procedures he carries out, the baby is first paralysed with an injection to keep it in position and stop it from moving, and then a second injection is administered to stop the baby's heart from beating. This barbaric procedure is on course to be legislated for in the coming months. A senior Irish obstetrician expressed concern recently in the Sunday Business Post that without providing for this type of feticide in the new law, babies could be born alive after failed abortions, something she was strongly opposed to, and incidentally, something which is a feature of the international abortion discussion because it happens regularly in countries where abortion is allowed. Talking about the baby, this doctor emphasised the need to, quote, ensure it is born sleeping, unquote, as part of, quote, a compassionate delivery of care, unquote. So we now know what the words compassion and care were referencing on all of those yes posters, and we need to ask ourselves if we're prepared to adopt this nothing to see here approach to abortion. Or are we going to be brave enough to honestly examine whether abortion is good for our country? So what of the third of voters who voted to retain the Eighth Amendment? Well, for a start, genuine freedom of conscience is being abandoned on foot of the referendum and is soon to be outlawed. Health Minister Simon Harris has made that abundantly clear. Compelling healthcare professionals who don't want to perform abortions to refer women to doctors who will is, I believe, unconscionable. Because what's the difference, I ask, between handing a person cocaine and arranging for them to get it from someone else? There's no essential difference. The end result is the same. The person looking for the cocaine gets it, thanks to the part that you have played either way. And the same is true with abortion. Pretending that freedom of conscience is protected by not forcing a doctor to carry out the procedure is a nonsense when the state is still coercing that same doctor to refer the woman to a colleague who will oversee ending the life of her baby through abortion. What this government is proposing is a colossal attack on human freedom and the right of an individual not to be forced to participate in something that goes against every fibre of their being and everything they stand for. This assault on freedom of conscience by the government must be opposed every step of the way. Otherwise, the notion of conscientious objection will be set at naught in Ireland, and we cannot agree to that. I think too that it's regrettable the way Leo Varadkar and Simon Harris publicly disparaged doctors and nurses seeking to exercise their freedom of conscience. The Taoiseach was quoted recently saying that we cannot have situations in the future where a woman is told, "You're on your own, love," when trying to access an abortion. I think that's a really crass and unacceptable way for our Taoiseach to portray hard-working doctors who happen to hold a different opinion to him on abortion. Simon Harris chimed in a few days later, saying that doctors who say, "Nothing I can do for you, can't even tell you where to go to access an abortion," well, they're not the doctors I know, he said. Again, what a demeaning and unfair way for a member of government to talk about some of the most compassionate and caring medics in the country. And let's not pretend that this is just about conscience either. What about those doctors who don't have a conscientious objection to abortion, but who refuse to refer because of the lack of medical evidence showing that abortion is good for a woman's health? Are they to be vilified by this law for using their best clinical judgment? And if we stand by and allow this, then aren't we all just agreeing to the corruption of our medical profession? Maybe the saddest aspect of this result is how it didn't need to be this way. How the government could have set its mind not to abortion, but to finding positive, life-affirming alternatives. This has already been done by people like Adi Stack, who have taken the initiative and set up Hughes House, a home for families of babies with life-limiting conditions who are receiving hospital care in Dublin. Adi sums up the vision that we should have as a society with these words: "If you're going to live for 100 seconds or 100 years, we have a country that is ready for you." That's the kind of country I think we all want to live in, and I believe that we'd be a lot closer to it if abortion hadn't been the focus for so long. Speaking in Dublin Castle, following the result, Leo Varadkar tried to reassure no voters that the country is still the same country today. But of course it's not. The Eighth Amendment is gone. And the Taoiseach now presides over a country where an entire group of human beings, unborn babies, have no constitutional protection, and where the right to life can be decided on a whim by popular vote. There's nothing enlightened or progressive about that. If anything, it's a radical drift backwards rather than a step forward. But I don't think for 1 minute that the pro-life movement is defeated in this country. There's no doubt in my mind that the result would have been very different if we'd had the kind of debate that gave a fair hearing to both sides. I don't think the mainstream media in Ireland will change anytime soon, but the discussion on abortion is not something which comes to an end, for one very simple reason: a human being dies in every abortion. In 1973, the day after the Supreme Court in the US legalized abortion in the Roe v. Wade decision, the New York Times welcomed the judgment as a final and reasonable resolution of a debate that has divided America for too long. 45 years later, the United States is on the cusp of restoring its pro-life laws. As pro-life campaigners in Ireland, we don't intend to wait that long to achieve our goal, but we'll stay the course for as long as it takes to restore full legal protection to pregnant mums and their unborn babies. Where there's life, there's hope. With abortion, there is no hope, just an irrevocable outcome that I believe betrays both women and their unborn babies. And it's why I'm confident that at some point in the future, we will again have a law similar to the Eighth Amendment in Ireland. I, for one, was very encouraged by the huge number of young people who became involved with the pro-life movement during the referendum campaign, and I am very hopeful for the future. I'm conscious too that speaking today, I'm addressing the only constituency that voted no in the referendum, and I know that there are people in this room who worked very hard on the campaign to achieve a result unlike the one that unfortunately we got. But what I would say is that pro-life campaigners are different to many other types of campaigners because they simply don't stop. I've heard many people talk about how in 1983 people gathered in rooms and set themselves the task of repealing the Eighth Amendment. Well, the Eighth Amendment has now been repealed, but I can assure anybody listening that there are already people working on how to put it back in or to put some form of constitutional protection or pro-life laws back in so that we are a country that protects everybody. Move forward, the pro-life movement will, because we believe that every human being deserves a chance of life. And for those who believe that that struggle is worth taking, it hasn't ended, it has simply changed. Thank you very much.